Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the webinar this afternoon on computer control in Grid 3. Lovely to have many of you here to listen in. We'll be about 30 minutes today. My name's Adam, and we're going to have a look at a range of areas around computer control today. So let's have a look at what we're going to cover, first of all. So we're going to have a look at what computer control is, who might benefit from computer control, who's going to find it useful. We're going to look at how we might use it to control the mouse and keyboard and use it with other access methods, and how we might use it to control other applications, as well as do some basic editing of existing resources and making your own computer control activities. Okay. So when we're thinking about who is it for? Let's quickly think about it being a resource to support someone who would otherwise find it difficult to use a standard keyboard and mouse. So it provides alternative access. So that might be through eye gaze or switch access or alternative pointer access such as a head mouse or a joystick. So it's providing really a series of on-screen keyboards that are completely dynamic and can be adapted to the needs of the user. So it's providing control of third-party applications, and by that I might mean something like Microsoft Word or a web browser, and giving full access to those programs with those alternative access methods. One thing, for those of you that know the grid or have used the grid before, is you may be aware that there are some what we call accessible apps built into the grid, and we would regard those as starting points or more basic applications for controlling things like email or a camera or your music or a web browser. So they'll provide some basic functionality of those things. But for some activities, computer control is going to be something that provides full functionality. So, for example, if you had someone who was very keen to do their online banking, or perhaps they were a DJ and wanted to control their music editing software, or a graphic artist who wanted to control their Photoshop application, they might well use something like computer control. So it provides much more functionality or full functionality of the applications that you want to use. Okay. So what we're going to do now is to move on to think about how and what computer control is within the grid. So I'm going to switch now into the grid 3. And you should see on my screen that I've already set up a user with a number of resources on it. So when you start the grid 3, one of the options you'll be given is to decide which grid sets you want to include within your user. And one option of the 7 different areas of grid is computer control, and this sits alongside many of our communication resources, accessible app resources, and so on. So on the screen at the moment you'll see a range of different computer control activities, and for the majority of this session we're going to look at the first 2 that are on the screen, the blue computer control grid set option and the green computer control for switches option. But I want to point out you'll also find computer control options within some of our well-known text communication grid sets, such as Fast Talker and the new Fast Talker Large Cell. And I suppose at the other end of the scale, you might also use computer control with someone who's just maybe a young child or someone who's experiencing eye gaze, for example, for the very first time and wants to use the grid to access that other program, in this case, Look to Learn or Look to Read. There are other applications that you can use. So there are many grids that have been built by a range of clinicians, Smartbox staff, parents and other users for supporting specific access to applications such as YouTube. And if I flick over, for example, Another example might be something like WhatsApp or the Microsoft packages such as Excel, PowerPoint and Word. But more of that later. So to begin with today, let's have a look at computer control. So I'm going to start by looking at the first computer control grid set here, the blue icon on the screen. I'm just going to launch that for a moment. And the first thing you notice is that unlike many of our standard full screen grid sets, a computer control grid set only occupies part of the screen, not all of it. So in this case, what you'll see on the right hand side is a slim sidebar, which is fundamentally giving me access to control a mouse. So I've got the option to do a left, a double, a right, but then there's a link to a keyboard. And finally, the Grid Explorer function gets me back to that Explorer screen I was just on. So the way this would work, and this, by the way, might be appropriate for someone who is using, in particular, an alternative pointer and or eye gaze, is I would select my action and then look or move my mouse to where I wanted to click. So it's providing an alternative way of clicking on the screen. So what I'm going to do in a moment is I'm going to open File Explorer on my Windows desktop and just show you how this grid set can be used to control some of those basic functions that many of us take for granted when we're using a computer. So think of it as a support for mouse control. So I'm going to click first of all on left, and that will activate a left mouse click mode. And as I move my mouse, nothing happens until I keep it still. When I keep it still for a moment, it zooms in on the icon that I'm trying to open and then completes a left click. There we go. My computer's running a bit slowly, but eventually, there we go. So you'll see I did a left click on File Explorer and it opens up the familiar access to folders within Windows. Now at the moment, as I move my mouse around, this might be eye gaze or a head mouse, nothing is happening because I haven't told the grid what action I want to use. So right now I want to go to Pictures, so I would need a double click normally to do that. So I've moved to double click, move across, choose Pictures, and it zooms in. Okay, and opens up my my Windows, my folder. But sometimes you want to do a series of double clicks, one after the other. So in that case, it can be quite useful to lock on the double click or the left click, whatever it is you're trying to do. So if I chose double click this time, and then chose it again, you'll see it changes colour slightly. I'm going to move over the folder called Attachments. And when I hover over it, it zooms in. Okay, and I've got one picture in this folder, and if I double click on that again, it happened automatically. I see a picture of a Smartbox dog. It must have been Pet Friday when that picture was taken. Okay, now if I've had a look at that picture and I want to then close that window, I can go back to left click and can look at the close button. Now at the moment I'm using a way of clicking called zoom to click when I'm clicking in on something, but that's something that we can change. So I'm going to quickly go into settings for the first time today. So I'm going to go up to the menu bar, I'm going to go to settings, and I go to my access method. So at the moment I've been using a mouse, which is a pointer, so I'm going to go to pointer, and in pointer, under computer control, you can see I've got zoom to click selected. So the first thing to note is I can change the zoom time, how long it takes before it begins to do a click. At the moment it's 2.5 seconds, but I can reduce that or increase that depending on perhaps how well I'm using my computer control or how fast I want things to happen. But the other thing we can do is we can change the clicking method. So I can choose to use dwell to click if I prefer. So I use dwell to click. It would offer me, let's just try it and see. So I'm going to use double click, and this time when I hover over, what you'll see is a dwell. Okay, there's no zoom. So it's a different way of selecting. So I'm just going to go back to zoom to click. So that was settings. Choose your access method, pointer, and choose your computer control method. Okay, so there's a couple of settings there to be aware of. So I'm just going to close that those windows manually for a second. Okay, so we can latch an action on, whether it's left click or double click. Those are the two most common items you might want to latch on. The other thing we obviously are probably going to want to do, so that's using a mouse, but we might also want a keyboard. So I'm just going to quickly open up Word. So here we go, I'm using that with my zoom to click to open up Microsoft Word, which is down the bottom here. And once Word is opened, I'm also going to go to my keyboard page because I'm just going to manually bring up a blank document. I might now want to use a keyboard. So a computer control grid, one of our standard grids, will typically have a on-screen keyboard. Most people these days will be familiar with some sort of on-screen keyboard, but it's providing prediction as well. So I can begin to type, and as I type, it's typing up into Word, not into the grid, and I'm getting some prediction options. So I can say, hello, my name is Adam. Okay. And then I can use my clicks to either save or to close the window in whatever way I want to do. Okay. One other thing that's available within the standard grid set is this option to move the grid. So sometimes your grid will be in the way of something you're trying to do. There might be an icon you're trying to do. So if we go to the More option, we will typically have a Move Grid option. And that will let us move it. In this case, in this grid set, it's set just to allow us to move either to left or right. We can go back again, move grid. And we also have some additional tools which will allow us, for example, to make the cells larger or smaller. Okay, so if I'm struggling with my cell size on a particular day, I can make cells larger or smaller. If I've got more than one program up, I can switch to next program. I can show the desktop, okay, and it shows the desktop, or I can show the next program. Okay, so it's allowing me some basic functionality to do some of the things we might otherwise do with a mouse. Okay, so I'm going to go back to Grid Explorer now for a second. And here we are back here. So what we're going to move on to now is we're going to have a look at where many of our users are not necessarily using, and they're using computer control because they find standard access to a computer difficult. And alternative access is sometimes inevitably slower than using a standard mouse or keyboard. So accessing a computer being slower, particularly if you've got a physical disability, can be especially frustrating if you've previously used a computer without difficulty. And switch users in particular can find this. So what we're going to have a look at now is how we might use switches with computer control, because we need the computer control grid to do a bit more than the functionality I've just shown you there. We need full control of all of our applications without moving a mouse if possible. If you've not used switches before, I'm just going to briefly fire them up and set them up. So I'm going to use today my keyboard as switches. So a switch would normally be a physical button. In this case, I'm going to use two keyboard keys. I'm going to go to settings to set this up. I'm going to go into access and switches. I'm going to choose my connection. So typically on a device this might be a joystick, but here I'm going to use keyboard. And I've already set up a number 1 and then a number 2 on my keyboard as my switches. But if I want to use different keys, I have this change key option, which allows me to capture what I want to be as my switch. So there we go. So switch 1, I'll just check them, and switch 2. Okay. So one last thing to do is to say how I'm going to use my switch. So a switch allows me to navigate grids by pressing one button, or two buttons if I so desire it. So I'm going to click on activation, and a typical setup would be scan rows then cells. I'm going to use two switches today, So I'm going to use the option tap to advance. I've got my first switch set up to activate. So that's my selecting switch. And I'm going to choose a second switch to be my moving or my advanced switch. And I can just test those to check everything's working. Always a good idea when you're setting up switches. And a typical switch scan will move through the rows of a keyboard where you can choose your row with your other switch and then move along until you get to the letter or function that you want and then select. Okay, so let's try that to first of all launch the green computer control with switches. So I'm going to select that row, I'm going to move along that row, when I've got that I'm going to select. Okay, so the first thing you'll notice is that rather than be down the right hand side, the computer control grid set with switches sits at the bottom of the screen and has a few more buttons and different buttons. So we have some jump cells to keyboards, as you'd expect. We have some mouse functions, but we have also control of arrows, function keys, other windows, and other programs. So we're doing a great deal more than we were before. So the first thing I'm going to do is show you how, in this case, using my switches, I might choose to launch a web browser. In this case, I'm going to launch Google Chrome. So I'm going to start moving along my row until I get to the option that says Start. I'm going to select Start, and you'll see that as a standard, and I haven't changed this, 3 starting points are given to you. They're fairly common things you might want to do. One is to open a program like Microsoft Word, Google Chrome, and of course the Smartbox website, which I'm going to open now. So again, I'm going to move along until the Smartbox website is highlighted, and if I press my switch, the program is launched automatically, and the website is launched automatically. You'll see that coming up now. Okay, so I may want to be able to scroll up and down this grid set. So I'm going to navigate back to the arrows page. So back to home, and then if I go to arrows, I should find I've got some up and down arrows to let me scroll up and down this screen. There they are on the top line. So I'm going to move along to down, and you can see that I'm gradually navigating down this screen, and my down arrow was red. So that kept automatically scrolling, and I wasn't having to press anything to do that, and that's really useful for switch users who would otherwise have to keep navigating back to the down arrow. So I'll do that one more time, and this time I'm going to interrupt the down halfway through by pressing my switch a second time. So I'll leave it going for a couple of seconds, and if I press my switch now, because I want to read something, the scrolling stops and allows me to read the website. Okay, so I'm beginning to see that I can do more without moving a mouse. I've not moved a mouse at all so far. So another thing we might want to do is to be able to open up another tab. So I'm just going to use my mouse for speed. I'm going to go back, and this time I'm going to go to a keyboard. So one of the things that is really important when you're using computer control is to think about the most efficient way to do something. So the most efficient way to do something on a web browser or in another application, if they're available, is to use a keyboard shortcut or a keyboard hotkey. And you can usually find them by web searching for them. There are lots of keyboard shortcuts for things like Microsoft Word and PowerPoint, and also for web browsers such as Internet Explorer and Google Chrome. So in this example, I want to open up a second tab. It's something most of us will have done. So I've got my Smartbox website open, but I want to open a new search page. So I know that the keyboard shortcut for that is Control T. So I'm going to choose Control, and then I'm going to choose T, and hey presto, a new web page has been launched. If I'm going to go to the, I can make that even more efficient. So I had to know it was Control T, and I had to make 2 selections, and with a switch it would have taken quite a while to do that. If I go to my arrows page, you'll see that I've got some functionalities built in, like undo, cut, copy, paste, and I've got a spare cell done here. So I'm going to do a little bit of editing now. Go into editing mode. I'm going to select my blank cell. and I'm going to create a button that does a Control T for me. And the way you would do that is create a cell, and we're going to use a command in Grid 3 called keyboard key. The easiest way to do that is to search for keyboard, and you can see there's a range of different keys, commands that you can use. There's a couple of keyboard keys. The advanced one gives you a bit more functionality to hold keys down, but almost always this keyboard key is a really good starting place. So I've added a keyboard key, and on the left hand side I can now choose what this command is going to send. So I can choose capture, and on my keyboard now I'm pressing Control, and it knows that I've pressed left Control, and after that I can press T. Alright, so I'm just going to change the label and say that this is a Control T. Finish editing. I'm going to check that this is working. So if I press my Control T now, in one motion it's opened up a new tab. So there is the way you can begin to quickly adapt and begin to adapt a grid set to provide even more functionality for someone, no matter what their access method is. Particularly useful as well, particularly for a switch user. Okay, so another really useful way of speeding somebody up when they're navigating their computer is to give them buttons that launch programs. So I'm going to go back to Home for a moment. I'm going to go back to the Start button, and you can see that there are 3 given to you as examples, and we're going to add a new one now. I'm going to imagine that I wanted to be able to control PowerPoint. So a really useful tip is, you'll notice at the moment PowerPoint is not running. So a useful tip is to look and see if you've got it on your computer already. I'm just going to launch it manually. I'll close it again in a moment so we can see this working. So PowerPoint is now running. Okay. If I go back into editing mode now, it's going to make the next step much easier for you to complete. So I'm going to click on each of these cells and notice what the command is. There's a command called Start Program behind each of these buttons. So that's the command we need to use. So blank cell, create cell. The command was Start Program. So there's lots of commands starting with Start, but there it is. It's the blue Programs command. So that's stage 1. Now why I launched Microsoft PowerPoint is because it shows you the programs you've got running, and this makes life a lot easier. So I'm going to select Microsoft PowerPoint and click OK. It automatically gives me an icon and a label. I can finish editing, save my changes. I'm going to close PowerPoint now. I'm going back to my switches, and you can see that I'm navigating along my programs, and if I then launch PowerPoint, one button has launched it, and it means that someone does not have to be able to navigate to the Start button to move a mouse across the PowerPoint. With one click they can launch a program. And for those of you on my keyboard now, I would press Enter. So a switch user would be able at this point to go to their keyboard and to use Enter to start a blank PowerPoint presentation and to continue editing. Okay, so that's fine, but not everything in life, unfortunately, has a keyboard shortcut or is necessarily as easy to do that. Now, it's also that you may not always use an application every day. It might be a rare occurrence to use a particular application. So it's useful for a switch user, for someone with an alternative access, to be able to move a mouse without it being a physical mouse. So in this grid set, we've also, if I go to Home and Mouse, I'm going to quickly show you that I can move my mouse pointer, which I'm going to put in the middle of the screen. There it is. I can move the mouse pointer without moving my mouse by using switches. So again, I'm going to use my switches to navigate down to radar mouse, or to one of these direction arrows. Let's go right a bit to begin with. So I'm going to select that row and navigate across to the right arrow. And if you watch the mouse cursor, which is in the middle of the screen at the moment, you'll see that a crosshair appears and the mouse begins to move across the screen automatically being controlled by the grid. And if I press my switch again, it stops. So you can see that's not fast, but it does allow me to get anywhere on my screen in time. Now another way of doing that, perhaps a bit quicker, is to use radar mouse. And that, a bit like a submarine sonar, moves a line around the screen. So if I want to go off towards slideshow, you can now see that with one selection I start moving, and another selection is moving along the line. Press my switch, and now I'm much closer to slideshow, and I'm ready to use my left arrow to get a precise point. When I've got there, I would go and find my left click. So I'll just quickly do that. And you can see I've clicked on slideshow. So that's how someone who didn't have other ways of moving a mouse could move a mouse around their grid. It's not hugely efficient. A keyboard keystroke is usually quicker and faster if at all possible, but it means that everything is accessible if it needs to be within a computer control. Okay, so that's looking at some of our basic resources, our two main resources. I'm going to close PowerPoint now for a moment, and I'm going to go back to Grid Explorer. I think one other thing just to point out is people often ask me, well, what makes it a computer control grid set? If I go into editing mode on this particular grid, on this particular page, the start page of computer control for switches, I've gone into editing mode and up to the menu bar. If I go to grid, you can see that computer control is highlighted. So a grid typically is either computer control or referred to as a normal grid. And also, how do I know where it's positioned? Well, in this case it's positioned in the bottom, but you can choose to make a grid sit wherever you want and to be what size you want it to be as well. So that's how you make a grid become a computer control grid. Okay, so just to finish up with a couple of things, we're just going to quickly go back to Grid Explorer and point out that those are not the only resources available for you to use. Many of our users will use computer control as part and parcel of their communication. So they might well use a grid like FastTalker, and within FastTalker you will find there are some resources to support communication and other features and accessible apps. But there's also a computer control element which will give you access to some basic sort of computer control for alternative access or eye gaze. If you needed something that was a little bit larger, go back to Grid Explorer, you might want to look at the new FastTalker large cells, and in the same way cells are larger. If I go to computer, what you'll see now is the cells for computer control are several times bigger than on the previous grid. Okay, so more accessible for someone who has some gross motor difficulties or is struggling with accessing small cells. If you're looking for program-specific control, then there are some other grids that you can find. So you'll see on my screen I've got a YouTube grid, I've got computer control web access, which is controlling Internet Explorer and gives additional functionality. It's useful to know where to look for these. And we use these are all available on the Online Grids website. It's going to go up to the menu bar, choose Add, go to Online Grids, and a useful tip here is you can either use the search tool and search what you're looking for, or use one of the categories and use computer control and look at what's available. So look for things like WhatsApp, look for things like Skype, as you can see there. There's a range of different resources that you can use. Okay. So at that point I'm going to stop and I'm going to see if there are any questions. And while people are thinking about that, I'm also going to say that I usually, when I do these, ask our support team what some of the frequently asked questions are, because they're always asked, and the things that people come back time and time again and ask are. So I think one of the things that often comes up is what can you do if you haven't got a keyboard shortcut available to you, and you can use a function called set mouse position to put the mouse in a particular position. Can you use it with touch? Yes, you can, but maybe not radar mouse, wouldn't work in quite the same way. So those are some of the sorts of things that come up again. So I think one of the things I would say is that if I just go to my computer control grid set, in fact let's go to YouTube, I'll just do this last thing to finish with. This is the YouTube website, and you'll see that I've launched Internet Explorer and my grid is down the bottom here. Now it may be that I want to visit a particular part of the screen. I'll skip that. I may want to regularly visit music, so I'm going to quickly add an extra cell, and this is about putting the mouse in a particular position. I'm just going to insert a new blank cell. So I mentioned the command called set mouse position, so let's search for it. There it is. So what this allows you to do is to capture a set position of a mouse. So I'm going to choose set position on the left. I'm going to click where I want the mouse to be clicked, and I'm going to finish editing. I'm just going to see how that works. Okay, so I'm going to choose this button, this blue button down here that I've not labeled or anything, but as I click on it, you'll watch the mouse position will automatically move to the position that I gave it. At least I hope it will. Or not, as the case may be. It's interesting. Okay, but it's a good way of moving a mouse again. And I've got a question here. Can you make text larger in WhatsApp? Okay, let's have a look and see. So often it would be about looking to see what the keyboard shortcut was for WhatsApp. So I'm going to go to my WhatsApp for computer control grid set and launch that here. You'll need to install, if you're using WhatsApp, you'll need to install the WhatsApp for from the whatsapp.com website. There's a download for it to run on your PC, on your desktop. I'll just close that one. And I'm hoping that's going to launch WhatsApp for computer control. And if you've got the WhatsApp application installed, which I haven't done on this computer, it would have launched the WhatsApp, and this will give you access to the main shortcuts that you need for WhatsApp. I'm not aware whether or not you can change the text size for WhatsApp. I think we'd have to find that out. So I suggest that the support team will be able to provide the answer to that. Okay. So if there are no other questions, I think what we'll do is we'll just put up my email address if anybody has any further questions. The other really useful email address to think about is support@thinksmartbox.com. And our great support team will always be happy to answer questions on anything you may have on computer control, help building a grid, questions like how do I make the text bigger in WhatsApp. If we don't know, we'll go away and try and see if we can find the answer out for you. One of the issues with computer control is the applications themselves and their limitations. So if WhatsApp haven't made it possible to make their text bigger, then the grid will not very easily be able to do that for you. But please feel free to get in contact if you have any more questions. I hope it's been helpful. Thank you very much for listening.